Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are embarking on, well, one of the most astonishing stories ever told. It's the incredible journey of us Homo sapiens.
It really is an epic tale.
Yeah, we're going to unpack how our species, once considered, an animal of no significance, just another creature out there, has somehow come to dominate the entire planet.
And not just dominate, but now we're standing on the edge of becoming something else entirely.
Yeah.
Something maybe like gods, as some sources put it.
Exactly. Our exploration today is going to lean heavily on some foundational work, particularly insights you might know from Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens.
A really thought-provoking book.
Totally. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the huge revolutions that shaped us, uncover some genuinely surprising things from our past, and, fundamentally understand how all that stuff impacts us right now, and maybe even more importantly, our future.
Yeah, where we might be headed.
We're going to trace this massive path, from the very beginning of the universe all the way to the potential end of Sapiens as we currently understand it. We're using a whole bunch of sources shared with us.
So buckle up.
Definitely. Get ready for an intellectual adventure that might just shift how you see, everything.
It's an absolutely immense canvas we're looking at. And you're right, we kind of have to start right at the beginning to get the sheer scale of this journey.
Right, like the very beginning.
The very beginning. Imagine about 13.5 billion years ago, boom, the Big Bang.
Yeah.
All the matter, energy, time, space we know just springs into existence.
That's physics territory. Mind-boggling.
Totally. Then fast forward billions of years, maybe 4.5 billion years ago, our own little planet Earth forms. The stage is set.
Okay.
Then, roughly 3.8 billion years ago, life itself starts bubbling up. That's where biology kind of takes over.
Still huge scales.
Immense.
Huh?
But for us Homo sapiens, the story starts to zoom in around 6 million years ago. That's when we think the last common grandmother of humans and chimps lived.
Okay, getting closer.
And then, more specifically, around 2.5 million years ago, the genus Homo evolves in Africa. That's a big moment, marked by the very first stone tools showing up.
It's pretty wild to shift from thinking about, cosmic stuff to our very specific biological roots. And when we look at our genus, Homo, evolving from earlier apes like Australopithecus, there's this one really obvious massive change, right? Brain size.
Oh, absolutely, a defining feature. Early Homo, they had brains around, say, 600 cubic centimeters.
Kind of small, relatively.
Yeah, but modern sapiens, us, we average much bigger, like 1,200 to 1,400 cubic centimeters.
And here's the thing that always gets me. Neanderthals. Their brains were actually, on average, bigger than ours.
That's right. It often surprises people.
It seems like such a no-brainer, pardon the pun, for evolution. Bigger brains must be better, right? So why didn't every animal go down that route? Why aren't we seeing, squirrels inventing warp drive? What made this huge brain thing so unique to Homo?
Exactly. It's not as straightforward as just bigger is always better for every creature in every situation.
Yeah.
What's really fascinating about our evolution is the incredible series of trade-offs that happened along the way.
Trade-offs. Like what?
Well, one of the biggest was standing up and walking on two legs, the upright gait.
Which seems like a good thing, right? Frees up the hands.
Huge advantages, yes. Hands free for tools, carrying things, seeing over tall grass to spot danger. But it came with a massive biological cost, a really big one.
Okay, what was the catch?
Especially for females.
Yeah.
Narrower hips. And this was happening at the same time our babies' heads were getting bigger because of those expanding brains we just talked about.
Oh, uh-oh. Narrower hips, bigger heads. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. So childbirth must have become incredibly dangerous then, right?
Precisely. For early human females, death in childbirth became a really, really significant hazard, a major risk. So natural selection then favored births happening earlier in the pregnancy. The babies were born prematurely. Their vital systems, brain included, were still underdeveloped. And crucially, their heads were still smaller and more pliable.
Right, unlike other animals.
Think about it, a foal or a calf. They can stand up, walk, even run shortly after birth. But a human baby, completely helpless, utterly dependent for years.
Yeah, totally dependent.
And this biological reality, this necessity for long, intensive childcare, it fundamentally reshaped our social structures. It basically demanded significant community support for mothers and their infants.
So it pushed us towards being more social.
Absolutely. It fostered cooperation, shared responsibility, deeper social bonds that were pretty unique among animals. It's a powerful example of how biology directly kind of forged these new social needs.
And it really makes you rethink that popular image we have of early humans, doesn't it? The caveman with a club dragging prey back, totally dominant. But our sources suggest something completely different about where they started their early niche. What was life really like back then?
Absolutely, that popular image,
Yeah.
largely a myth, especially for the really early humans. One of the most surprising things you learn is that humans living, say, a million years ago, even with those bigger brains and early stone tools, were far from being the top predators.
Really? Not at the top.
No way. They actually lived in constant, real fear. They very rarely hunted big animals. Their life was mostly about gathering plants, grabbing insects, maybe stalking some small animals,
Okay.
and crucially, eating carrion. They were scavengers, picking off the leftovers from much more powerful hunters like lions or hyenas.
So, like vultures with tools.
Kinda. Our sources indicate that one of the most common, earliest uses for those stone tools wasn't even for hunting big game. It was to crack open the bones left behind by other predators. To get to the marrow inside, it's super rich in fat and protein. Some researchers actually think that this was our original unique niche, our specialty. Like how a woodpecker is built to get insects from trees.
Correct.
We were the bone marrow specialists.
Wow. That is not the heroic picture you usually get. Much more humble.
Far more humble. They weren't at the top of the food chain at all. They carved out this very specific, specialized role way down the ladder. It's quite a shift in perspective thinking about our origins that way.
It's totally fascinating. It completely flips the script on what you imagine our ancestors doing.
Okay, so moving on from those early kind of specialized steps, let's talk about the moment that really truly set us apart, the game changer. Around 70,000 years ago, something profound happens, the cognitive revolution. What was the real deal here? What fundamentally made us us?
The game changer was huge. And it wasn't just language itself, because, lots of animals communicate in really sophisticated ways.
Right, like bees dancing or monkeys having different alarm calls. Exactly. Bees can tell each other where the good flowers are. Green monkeys have specific calls for leopard or eagle or snake.
Yeah.
What was truly uniquely powerful about Sapiens language after this revolution was its ability to transmit information about things that do not exist at all.
Things that don't exist. Like,
This is the critical difference. No other animal can really talk about stuff they've never seen or touched or smelled. Before this, an archaic human could maybe grunt, careful, lion nearby. That's useful, immediate info.
okay, practical.
But only Sapiens, after the cognitive revolution, could say something like, the lion is the guardian spirit of our tribe. It watches over us from the spirit world.
Wow. Okay, that is a massive leap. It's not just about the real world anymore. It's about fiction, shared stories.
Exactly. It's the ability to create and believe in common myths in these shared fictions. That became the secret sauce for large-scale, flexible cooperation among total strangers. Well, without it, human groups were pretty limited, like chimp groups. You can only really maintain stable relationships based on intimate personal knowledge with maybe, 150 individuals, tops.
The Dunbar number kind of thing.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But with shared myths, stories about gods, about nations, about abstract values like justice or human rights, Sapiens could form much, much larger groups that still felt connected and could work together. Tribes, ancient cities with tens of thousands, eventually huge empires ruling hundreds of millions.
So things like countries, religions, even companies.
Absolutely. Think about it. Modern states, like, say, France, or medieval churches, or even a massive corporation like Peugeot. These are all, in a very real sense, figments of our collective imagination, or what lawyers call legal fictions.
Right. Peugeot isn't a person you can shake hands with.
Exactly. It exists as a legal entity. It can own property, sign contracts, employ thousands of people. It functions because we all collectively agree to believe in its existence and the rules surrounding it. It's a truly powerful demonstration of how shared belief in fiction allows for cooperation on an absolutely massive scale. It lets us build these incredibly complex societies.
That's totally incredible when you think about it like that. It makes you realize how much of our world, our laws, our economy is built on these shared stories, these intersubjective realities. And this ability, this fiction weaving, it basically changed the rules, right? Moved us beyond just biology.
Precisely. That's one of the most significant takeaways. Unlike chimps, or even our earlier human relatives, whose social behavior was largely hardwired by their DNA, I mean, a chimp alpha male can't just suddenly declare universal chimp suffrage and expect everyone to follow along without some genetic change.
Right, it wouldn't stick.
But Sapiens, we could transmit entirely new ways of behaving culturally without any change in our genes. A really fascinating example our sources point to is the recurring phenomenon of childless elites throughout history.
Like who?
Think about the Catholic priesthood, or Buddhist monastic orders, or those powerful eunuch bureaucracies in imperial China. These are behaviors choosing not to reproduce that go directly against the most fundamental drive of natural selection.
Yeah, passing on your genes.
Exactly. Yet these celibate groups became incredibly powerful, stable, even central to the functioning of huge societies, purely because the idea, the culture, could be transmitted and sustained. This incredible flexibility, adapting and sharing new behaviors rapidly through culture was absolute key to our success. It let us adapt to wildly different environments and challenges in ways no other species possibly could.
And this flexibility, this power of shared stories and organization, it seems like it leads directly to the tragic fate of our closest cousins, the Neanderthals. If a single Neanderthal was maybe physically stronger, maybe better adapted to the cold, how did we, sapiens, end up being the ones left standing?
Yeah, it's a pretty stark reminder that social organization can trump individual strength. The cognitive revolution gave sapiens vastly superior social skills, and crucially, that unique ability to, well, compose fiction, to create stories about tribal spirits, ancestor gods, maybe just more complex, coordinated hunting plans involving abstract thought.
So we could work together better in bigger groups.
Much bigger, much more flexible, and ultimately more effective groups. When sapiens started moving into territories where Neanderthals had lived for ages, the Neanderthals weren't just meeting another type of human, they were meeting a completely new kind of social engine.
A social engine, I like that.
Sapiens groups could cooperate in larger numbers, share information more effectively, plan more complex actions. We likely became much more efficient hunters and gatherers, not just because of slightly better tools maybe, but because of these vastly superior social skills and coordination.
So even if one Neanderthal could beat one sapiens in a fight?
It wouldn't matter in the long run. A conflict between, say, a few hundred sapiens, united by a shared story with flexible tactics, versus maybe a smaller, less coordinated group of Neanderthals. Well, it was probably no contest. The Neanderthals, likely stuck in smaller, more rigid social structures, probably found it harder and harder to compete for resources. Their populations dwindled, and slowly, tragically, they just faded out. It wasn't brute force alone, it was the power of collective imagination and coordination.
It's absolutely chilling, really, to think about that dynamic playing out. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and try to step into the daily lives of these early sapiens after the cognitive revolution. For almost all of our history as a species, way before farming and cities, we lived as foragers, as hunter-gatherers. What was life really like for them compared to the myths and, the Flintstones cartoons?
Yeah, it's really important to start by clearing away some common misconceptions. Like, we often call that whole vast period the Stone Age.
Right.
But that's mostly an archaeological bias. Stone tools last for millennia, right? Things made of wood or bamboo or animal hides, they rot away, they disappear.
So we find the stones but miss the rest.
Exactly. It was probably more accurately the wood age or the bamboo age or the leather age. The vast majority of their tools and belongings were likely made from perishable materials we just don't find.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Also, all those endless debates scholars have were ancient foragers living in some kind of perfect ancient commune with total sharing and equality? Or did they practice strict eternal monogamy just like us, supposedly?
Hear those arguments?
Well, the truth is, they're based on really flimsy evidence. We just don't have written records from that time. All we have are fossilized bones, those stone tools, some amazing cave paintings. But frankly, you can interpret that stuff in a million different ways. Often, we just end up projecting our own modern ideas and biases onto the past.
So the hard evidence for their social structures is pretty limited. But what can we say with more confidence about maybe their individual knowledge and maybe surprisingly their quality of life?
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating. The individual knowledge that foragers possessed was likely immense. They had this incredibly deep, practical, intimate understanding of their immediate world.
Like what?
Like, they knew every stream, every type of edible plant or nut tree, every bear cave, every good spot to find flint for tools within their territory. Each person had to master a huge range of complex skills just to survive.
Give me some examples.
Making a sharp stone knife from scratch, mending a tear in a cloak, setting incredibly clever traps for rabbits or birds, knowing exactly how to react to dangers like sudden floods or snake bites or, running into a hungry lion.
Stuff we have no clue about today.
Absolutely none. This required years of learning, practice, apprenticeship. The average ancient forager could probably whip up a usable spear point from a piece of flint in minutes. Most of us today, we'd be totally lost, even with a YouTube tutorial.
Huh, true.
So paradoxically, while our collective human knowledge today is obviously vastly greater across science, tech, everything, individually, ancient foragers were arguably the most knowledgeable and skillful people in history when it came to practical survival and understanding their immediate world. And there's even some intriguing, though debated, evidence suggesting that the average size of the sapiens' brain might have actually decreased slightly since the foraging era.
Decreased. How is that possible?
Well, the theory is that with the rise of agriculture and specialization in complex societies, individuals didn't need to know everything anymore. You could rely on the baker for bread, the soldier for protection, the priest for spiritual guidance. Less need for that holistic individual mastery of everything.
That is a huge surprise. It totally goes against our usual idea of constant linear progress in every single aspect of being human. Okay, so they were individually skilled.
Yeah.
What about their overall lifestyle? Was it nasty, brutish, and short, like Hobbes said? Or,
Well, that's another really counterintuitive finding that's emerged. Many researchers now argue that foragers often enjoyed a more comfortable and rewarding lifestyle than many of the peasants or serfs or even early factory workers who came later.
more comfortable?
For one thing, they likely worked fewer hours. Many people in affluent societies today work 40, 45, maybe more hours a week. People in developing countries often work even longer, hunter-gatherers. Studies of modern groups suggest they often got by working maybe 30 to 45 hours a week, finding food and doing chores.
That's less than many of us work now.
And their diet. It was incredibly varied and usually very nutritious. They ate a wide range of plants, nuts, insects, small animals, occasional big game. This diversity made them much less vulnerable to famine than farming societies were later.
How so?
Farmers often relied heavily on just one or two staple crops, like wheat or rice. If that one crop failed because of drought or pests or disease, the whole society could face starvation. Foragers, with their diverse menu, could usually find something else to eat if one food source became scarce. They definitely faced hardship and periods of hunger, but they generally had more resilience, spreading their risks. Some anthropologists even call them the original affluent society.
So it wasn't all just primitive struggle then? Sounds almost idyllic in some ways, but surely it wasn't perfect. What about social complexities or potential conflicts? Our source mentioned the Ache tribe as an example of some maybe harsher realities.
Right, the Ache, a foraging group from Paraguay studied in the 20th century,
Yeah.
show us that life was complex and definitely not always idyllic. We shouldn't romanticize it. Their nomadic lifestyle, constantly needing to move and sometimes evade enemies, led to some incredibly harsh attitudes toward anyone who might slow the group down or become a burden.
Like who?
Like the sick, the very old, sometimes even unwanted children. There are accounts of them abandoning or, in some cases, even killing individuals who couldn't keep up. Seems brutal to us, absolutely. But in their context, it might have been perceived as a brutal necessity for the survival of the group in a really dangerous world.
Wow. Okay, definitely not idyllic. What about their spiritual beliefs?
Many forager societies seem to have held what anthropologists call animistic beliefs. This generally means they believe the world was full of animated beings, not just humans. Animals, plants, rocks, rivers, storms, all could have awareness, feelings, agency.
So they could communicate with a specific deer or a particular tree?
Potentially, yes. Or at least they perceive these non-human entities as beings you could interact with, maybe appease or learn from. There wasn't necessarily a strict hierarchy with humans at the top. Non-human beings weren't just resources for humans, nor were they usually seen as all-powerful, distant gods judging from afar. The world, for them, likely didn't revolve solely around human concerns.
But we don't know the specifics, right?
Exactly. We have to be really careful here. Specific details about ancient spirituality. Highly speculative. We're working from limited evidence, some burial sites, those incredible cave paintings, maybe some carved objects. They hint at complex inner lives, but the precise meanings are largely lost to time. We piece together what we can, tentatively.
And sticking with those harsh realities, what about violence? Was forager life a constant war of all against all? Or were they peaceful? You hear both arguments.
Yeah, that's a really contentious debate, and the archaeological evidence honestly points in both directions. It's complicated.
How so?
Well, for example, you look at a large survey of about 400 skeletons from Portugal, all dating from before agriculture. Only 2 of those skeletons showed clear signs of violence. 2 out of 400.
That sounds pretty peaceful.
Right. And a similar big survey in pre-agricultural Israel found only one skull out of hundreds that had damage likely caused by human violence. But then you find other sites that tell a completely different story.
Like where?
Like a site called Jabal Sababa in Sudan, dated to around 12,000 years ago. Nearly half the skeletons found there had arrowheads embedded in them or other clear marks of violence. Or the Afnet Cave in Germany, where archaeologists found caches of skulls, mostly women and children, that had clearly been bashed in. Maybe up to 40% showed violent trauma.
Whoa. So completely different pictures.
It's exactly. This huge variation tells us that violence rates differed massively between different forager groups and across different times and places. So our sources rightly warn us. We really should beware of demonizing or idealizing them. There was no single forager way of life when it came to violence. Some groups might have lived in relative peace for long stretches. Others might have been caught up in brutal, endemic warfare. It varied.
It definitely paints a much more complex, nuanced picture than the stereotypes allow. Okay, so that wraps up part one of our deep dive into early sapiens. Now let's transition to a truly monumental shift. I mean, the shift that changed absolutely everything, setting the stage for the complex, crowded, and often problematic world we live in today. The agricultural revolution. Our source even provocatively calls it history's biggest fraud. So let's really dig into this. How did this massive change happen, and why on earth would anyone call it a fraud?
Right. This profound shift to farming started relatively gradually, kicking off around 9500 to 8500 BC. The earliest signs are in the hill country of what's now southeastern Turkey, western Iran, and the Levant, the Fertile Crescent.
So not everywhere at once?
No, it was a slow burn, geographically limited at first, and then it spread out. Some of the key domestications happened early on. Wheat and goats around 9000 BC, peas and lentils by 8000 BC, things like olive trees around 4000 BC, grapevines maybe 3500 BC.
And these are still the basics for us today, right?
Absolutely. It's truly striking. Over 90% of the calories that feed humanity today still come from that handful of plants our ancestors domesticated way back then, between 9500 and 3500 BC.
Wow.
We're talking wheat, rice, maize, corn, potatoes, millet, barley. Our entire global food system, our cuisines, our very survival, are still dictated by the choices made by those ancient farmers. We haven't really domesticated any significant new staple plants or animals in the last 2,000 years. It's kind of amazing.
Okay, so it was foundational, but the fraud part, what was the catch? Why was it supposedly such a bad deal?
Well, the fraud argument, as laid out in sources like Sapiens, is that farmers, on average, ended up working much harder than their forager ancestors.
Harder work. Okay.
And critically, they actually got a worse diet in return. Less varied, often deficient in essential nutrients because they relied so heavily on just one or two starchy staples like wheat or rice.
So more work for worse food. That doesn't sound great.
Not at all. And beyond the increased labor and poorer diet, settling down in permanent villages, which farming pretty much requires, created entirely new problems. These settlements quickly became hotbeds for infectious diseases.
Why?
Living in close, permanent proximity to domesticated animals, accumulating human waste, contaminating water sources, the perfect storm for epidemics that just couldn't take hold in small, mobile forager bands.
So the core kind of chilling argument is this. Plants like wheat didn't just get domesticated by us. In a very real, profound sense, wheat actually domesticated Homo sapiens.
Wheat domesticated us.
Oh.
It manipulated us for its advantage. It made us invest more and more time, effort, and resources into its cultivation. Think about it. Foragers had a pretty varied, relatively comfortable life. But within just a couple of millennia, humans in many parts of the world were doing little else from dawn till dusk, besides tending their wheat fields, tied to the land, worrying about the harvest.
So we were effectively trapped by our own success, in a way. Sounds like a classic vicious cycle.
Precisely. It became what Harari calls the luxury trap. The initial promise, maybe, was a slightly easier life, a bit more food security. Let's just work a little harder, settle down, have more grain stored away.
Sounds reasonable initially.
Yeah, but that little extra food led to more children surviving. More mouths to feed meant you needed even more grain, which required clearing more land, working even harder, becoming even more dependent on that single crop. It created this relentless cycle, trapping farmers in a much more demanding, often less healthy, and more anxious existence than their foraging ancestors.
So why did agriculture spread if it was such a bad deal for individuals?
That's the key. Its irresistibility didn't come from immediate individual comfort. It came from its stark demographic advantage. Farmers, even if their individual lives were harder, could simply produce more food per unit of land than foragers could gather. This allowed farming populations to grow much faster and denser.
So they just outnumbered the foragers.
Exactly. Farmers could overcome foragers by sheer weight of numbers. If one band settled down and started farming, they'd grow faster, have more kids, and eventually, through sheer population pressure, they'd push out, absorb, or simply overwhelm the surrounding foraging groups who needed much larger territories to sustain themselves. It was like a slow-motion demographic steamroller.
Yeah.
Once it got going, it was almost impossible to stop.
That's a powerful and, yeah, frankly, kind of chilling idea that our greatest innovation might have been a form of self-inflicted hardship driven by demographics. But you mentioned Göbekli Tepe earlier. There's this intriguing alternative idea about what might have kicked off agriculture, right? Tied to these huge ancient structures, it makes you wonder about the real motivations.
Yes, the Göbekli Tepe theory is genuinely mind-bending and challenges the standard story. Usually we think, people find fertile land, they settle down, build a village, maybe it prospers, and then once they have surplus food and time, they build a temple or some big monument to show off or thank the gods.
Right. The temple comes after the village is established.
But Göbekli Tepe, this amazing site in southeastern Turkey with these huge, elaborately carved stone pillars, it's incredibly old. It dates back to around 9500 BC, which is significantly before agriculture was widespread in that region. The people who built it were likely still foragers.
So the monument came before the farming.
It seems so. This suggests a radical alternative. Maybe it was the need to build and maintain large monumental structures like Göbekli Tepe that actually drove the intensification of wheat cultivation, not the other way around.
How'd that work?
Well, imagine you need to gather hundreds, maybe thousands of people together for periods of time to quarry stone, carve pillars, erect these massive structures, and perform rituals there. You need a huge, reliable supply of food to feed all those workers and participants. Wild wheat was abundant in the area, but gathering enough might have been tough.
So they started deliberately planting it.
It's plausible that foragers switched from just gathering wild wheat to actively cultivating it, maybe initially not to improve their daily diet, but specifically to generate the massive surplus needed to support these large-scale communal projects, these religious or social centers. This really flips the script, suggesting maybe collective belief, ritual, the need to build something monumental together was the initial engine driving agriculture, rather than just the simple desire for more food or an easier life.
That is a seriously cool, mind-bending possibility. And the costs of this agricultural revolution, they weren't just borne by humans, were they? What about the animals we domesticated? Our sources highlight some pretty brutal practices.
Yeah, what's truly fascinating here, and often conveniently ignored in our narratives of progress, is how our relentless drive for human benefit completely disregarded the subjective experience, the fate, of all the other animals involved.
How so?
Well, you could argue that domesticated chickens and cattle are huge evolutionary success stories, right? Their population has exploded from maybe a few million wild ancestors to billions today. They're everywhere.
Okay, in terms of numbers, yeah.
But from the perspective of the individual animal, our sources argue they're also among the most miserable creatures that ever lived. The whole process of domestication was founded on a series of brutal practices, controlling their breeding, restricting their movement, altering their bodies, that only became exponentially crueler and more mechanized with industrial farming.
Can you give some examples?
Think about modern dairy cows, often kept indoors, repeatedly artificially inseminated, their calves taken away almost immediately after birth to maximize milk production. Or those calves themselves, especially males destined for veal, sometimes kept in tiny crates where they can barely move, fed liquid diets, denied social interaction, all to keep their muscles tender.
That's horrific.
Or the chilling reality in the egg industry, where billions of newly hatched male chicks are deemed economically useless because they can't lay eggs. They're often sorted on conveyor belts and then instantly killed, sometimes shredded alive in grinders or suffocated in gas chambers. This hyper-efficient industrial agriculture treats living creatures possessing complex emotional worlds as if they were machines, causing immense systematic suffering on an unimaginable scale. It's a really dark, often unacknowledged underside to the story of human agricultural success.
It truly is a dark side, one we often just don't want to think about. And finally, looking at the human side again, how did the agricultural revolution fundamentally change our relationship with time, especially how we think about the future?
It transformed it completely, and in ways that still shape our thinking today. Foragers, generally speaking, lived very much in the present. They obviously planned ahead a bit where to find water tomorrow, when the berries might ripen. But there wasn't much point obsessing about things far off or things they couldn't control, like next year's rainfall. Their focus was largely immediate.
Okay.
The agricultural revolution, however, made the future immensely important, and often a huge source of anxiety. Farmers had to constantly keep the future in mind. Their whole life revolved around seasonal cycles, planting now for a harvest months away. They constantly worried about drought, floods, pests, blight. Will the harvest be good enough? Will we have enough stored grain to survive the winter?
So constant worry about what's coming.
Constant future-oriented planning and anxiety. They had to invest immense labor now for a payoff later. They had to save seeds, maintain tools, build granaries. This created a fundamentally different mindset, one deeply concerned with predicting, controlling, and securing the future. This constant forward-looking anxiety, this need to plan and save and worry about tomorrow, is a direct and enduring psychological legacy of the agricultural revolution, deeply embedded in the cultures of farming societies and arguably in ours today.
Right. Okay, so farming brought huge challenges, population booms, and this need for future planning. But it also became clear that organizing these much larger societies required entirely new methods. So what does this all mean for how we actually scaled up? How did we go from small bands of maybe a few dozen foragers to massive cities, kingdoms, empires with millions of people? How did we manage that incredible leap in cooperation without, a biological instinct for it?
You've hit on the absolute crux of the matter. Just having more people, which agriculture provided, wasn't enough. You could have thousands of people crammed together, but without organization, it's just chaos, maybe even more conflict. The truly critical breakthrough was the creation and maintenance of what our sources call imagined orders.
Imagined orders. We touched on this with the cognitive revolution, right? Like shared myths.
Exactly, but taken to a whole new level of complexity and societal penetration. Our brains, as we said, are brilliant at handling social information in small groups. We can remember who's trustworthy, who owes us a favor, who's related to whom, maybe for up to 150 people or so.
Okay.
But when societies exploded in size after agriculture, a totally different kind of information became vital. Not just gossip, but numbers, laws, complex rules and regulations. How do you possibly keep track of taxes for tens of thousands of people? Or intricate property lines for millions? Or manage the logistics for feeding a huge army? Most human brains simply weren't built for that kind of data processing. They just, overdose and fall asleep, as Harari puts it.
So our biology couldn't keep up with their demographics.
Precisely. And the time between the start of agriculture and the rise of the first cities and states was way too short for evolution to catch up and give us new biological instincts for mass cooperation. So humans had to rely entirely on those shared myths and fictions. But these myths had to become much more elaborate, detailed, and binding than just stories about tribal spirits.
Like what kind of myths?
Like the elaborate legal and social hierarchies you see codified in things like the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon around 1750 BC. It lays out very clearly that society is divided into distinct classes, superiors, commoners, slaves, and two genders, and assigns vastly different rights, responsibilities, and punishments based on which fictional category you fall into. These imagined orders are presented not as human inventions, but as natural and inevitable, often ordained by the gods.
So they claim to be objective reality, but they're actually just stories we tell ourselves.
Exactly. Compare Hammurabi's explicit hierarchy to, say, the American Declaration of Independence, which famously states all men are created equal and have unalienable rights. Beautiful words, incredibly powerful ideas. But biologically speaking, people just evolved. They certainly didn't evolve to be biologically identical or equal. And the idea of inherent rights, that's not a biological reality you can find under a microscope. Equality and rights are incredibly important biological fictions, shared beliefs that we collectively agree make for a better, more just society, and we build our legal and political systems upon them.
So these are fictional hierarchies or fictional concepts like equality that become incredibly real and powerful in how they shape people's actual lives and opportunities. Can you give us some more examples of how these imagined orders translated into, well, often really cruel discrimination throughout history?
Oh, absolutely. History is tragically full of examples where these figments of imagination get translated into cruel and very real social structures. In ancient China, there was a myth about the goddess Nuwa creating aristocrats from fine yellow earth, but commoners from plain brown mud. That story provided a powerful, seemingly divine justification for a rigid social hierarchy for centuries.
Wow. Based on mud quality.
Right. Or think about the Hindu caste system in India. It emerged maybe 3,000 years ago. dividing society into strict hereditary groups, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, and Dalits, outside the system dictating everything from who you could marry to what job you could do to who you could even share food with. It was entirely a human invention, based on myths about purity and cosmic order, not some biological reality. Yet it created profound, often brutal, divisions for millennia.
And more recently.
Look at the infamous Jim Crow laws in the American South after the Civil War. Black people were legally prohibited from voting, attending white schools, eating in white restaurants, even drinking from the same water fountains. All of this was rationalized by pseudoscientific myths claiming inherent biological inferiority. These imagined orders create these awful, vicious circles of discrimination.
How so?
Well, the fictional hierarchy leads to discrimination, say, denying education to a certain group. Then, the resulting lack of education or opportunity in that group is pointed to as proof of their supposed inferiority, which then justifies further discrimination. The fiction creates the reality, which then seems to validate the fiction. It's a terrible feedback loop.
And this pattern seems to apply almost universally to gender hierarchy, doesn't it? Across so many different cultures and time periods. This really raises a huge question. Why? Why this near universal pattern of men generally holding more power and status than women, if it's not purely down to biology?
It's one of the biggest, most persistent, and frankly most frustrating questions in the study of human history and society. Across almost every culture we have records for, we see some form of gender hierarchy, where men, as a group, tend to dominate public life, hold more formal power, and often have more legal rights and social privileges than women.
Give me some examples again.
Think about the historical preference for boys in many cultures, like China, where under the one-child policy, it sometimes led to the abandonment or even killing of baby girls, creating huge gender imbalances. Or look at ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. Women there had virtually no independent legal standing, couldn't own significant property, couldn't vote or participate in the assembly. Even how we define masculinity itself changes dramatically. King Louis XIV of France, with his high heels and powdered wig, was the pinnacle of masculinity in his day.
Right, so purely biological explanations seem insufficient.
Our sources strongly challenge them. The idea that it's all down to men's greater average muscle power doesn't hold up. People in their 60s often rule over much stronger people in their 20s. Plantation owners weren't physically stronger than the slaves they controlled. Power comes from social organization, not just brute strength.
What about theories based on aggression or different survival strategies?
Also problematic. While there might be average differences, they don't explain the near universality or the specific forms patriarchy takes. And you find fascinating counterexamples in the animal kingdom, like bonobos, our close relatives, who live in largely matriarchal or egalitarian societies, even though males are somewhat larger. So if it's not purely biology dictating this near universal pattern, well, the real reasons remain one of the great unsolved puzzles. There are countless theories, sociological, psychological, economic, historical, but no single universally accepted answer. It really forces us to question assumptions about what's natural.
It's truly remarkable and unsettling how much of our social reality, even today, seems built on these deeply ingrained historical patterns that might not have a clear biological basis. Okay, speaking of foundations, how did human societies actually overcome that fundamental mental bottleneck you mentioned earlier? The problem of our brains not being built to handle the sheer volume of data needed for large, complex societies, all those tax records, property deeds, laws.
Exactly. That was a massive hurdle. The human brain, brilliant as it is for navigating the social complexities of a small band, just wasn't evolved to memorize and process the vast amounts of numerical and administrative data that became essential once you had cities, states, and eventually empires with millions of people.
Like trying to run modern accounting software on a Stone Age brain.
Pretty much. How do you keep track of who paid their grain tax in a city of 50,000? How do you manage the inventory of a royal storehouse? How do you record complex legal judgments or business contracts accurately so they can be referred to later? Relying on individual human memory just wasn't scalable or reliable enough. This mental limitation, this inability to handle massive data sets, severely constrained the potential size and complexity of human societies for a long time.
So what was the solution?
This fundamental need, this massive data management problem, was the primary driver behind the invention of writing. It wasn't invented primarily for poetry or love letters or philosophical treatises. It was invented to handle boring administrative data. It was a direct response to a cognitive bottleneck.
So writing emerged out of pure necessity. For bean counters, basically, not for poets.
Pretty much, yeah. It's another common misconception. The earliest form of writing we know of, Sumerian cuneiform, emerging in Mesopotamia around 3500–3000 BC, wasn't initially used for epic stories or religious texts. It was what linguists call a partial script,
Partial.
meaning it was primarily used to record very specific types of information, mainly numbers and nouns. Things like 29,086 measures, barley 37 months Kushim. That's an actual surviving tablet, likely a record of grain delivery overseen by someone named Kushim. It was used for tax accounts, inventories, records of debts, maybe some lists of names or places, and even homework exercises for apprentice scribes learning the system.
So, spreadsheets on clay.
Essentially, yes. It couldn't really express complex grammatical sentences, abstract ideas, emotions, or beautiful flowing prose. It was purely functional, a tool designed specifically for managing the increasing flood of administrative information that was overwhelming human memory.
Like King Zimrilim you mentioned.
Exactly. King Zimrilim of Mari, ruling around 1776 BC, had an archive of thousands upon thousands of clay tablets dealing with everything from military logistics and trade agreements to trivial property disputes. Managing that sheer volume of information required sophisticated organizational systems, and writing was the absolute foundation. Only later, over centuries and millennia, did these partial scripts gradually evolve into full scripts, capable of capturing the full range of spoken language, open the door for literature, history, philosophy, science, and everything else we associate with writing today. But it started with accounting.
Fascinating. Okay, we've talked about these imagined orders like laws and hierarchies and the invention of writing as key tools for scaling up human cooperation within societies. Now let's explore how these separate human worlds, these different societies and cultures, began to actually merge and connect, eventually leading towards the single, interconnected global system we have today. Here's where it gets really interesting. How did we go from all these distinct communities, often isolated, sometimes hostile, to becoming, in many ways, a single global unit?
That's a huge transition, and our sources point to three major forces driving this global unification, acting over long periods. The first one is money.
Money. Okay. How did that unify people?
Well, think about the limitations of simple barter, the direct exchange of goods and services. If I'm a farmer with a surplus of apples and I desperately need new shoes, I have to somehow find a shoemaker who not only has the right size shoes, but also happens to want apples right now.
The double coincidence of wants sounds inefficient.
Incredibly inefficient, especially for anything beyond very small, simple economies. It severely limits trade and specialization. The invention of money brilliantly solved this problem. Money is truly the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised.
Mutual trust. How so? Money itself isn't valuable, right? It's just shells or paper or bits in a computer.
Exactly. Money works because everyone agrees to trust the system. It represents a shared collective belief in an agreed-upon medium of exchange that everyone, even total strangers who don't trust each other personally, is willing to accept as payment because they trust that other strangers will also accept it from them later. It connects people who have nothing else in common.
And the forms money has taken are incredibly diverse, aren't they? It really shows how fundamental the idea is, regardless of the physical token.
Absolutely. It highlights the power of that shared belief. Take cowrie shells, for example. Just simple seashells. But they were used as money for an astonishing 4,000 years across huge parts of Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Oceania. They were durable, portable, hard to counterfeit easily in large quantities. Their use was so widespread, they even influenced the shape of some early Chinese characters related to money and value.
Wow. And cigarettes in POW camps.
Another classic example. In environments where official currency disappears, people spontaneously adopt other items with perceived value as a medium of exchange. Cigarettes worked because they were relatively standardized, divisible, portable, and had intrinsic demand within the camp population. Then you get the next major leap. Coinage.
Like the Lydian coin.
Exactly, emerging in Lydia, in modern Turkey around 640 BC. These coins, usually made of gold or silver alloys, had two revolutionary advantages over just using unmarked lumps of metal. First, they were minted to a standard weight and purity, guaranteed by whoever issued them. Second, and crucially, they bore the stamp or mark of that issuing authority, a king, a temple, a city.
So you knew what you were getting and who backed it.
Precisely. This massively facilitated trade over long distances and enabled the rise of large-scale empires. Imagine the Roman Empire trying to collect taxes and grain from Egypt, transport it all the way to Britain, and then somehow use that grain to pay the legions stationed there. Logistically impossible. But with standardized, portable, universally accepted coins, They could manage taxes, pay soldiers, fund huge projects across vast distances. Money became the essential lubricant, the very bloodstream of large-scale political and economic organization.
So money is this incredible tool for trust and cooperation between strangers, fueled by collective belief. But our sources also mention a darker side to this whole system, this gospel of gold. What's the downside?
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. The relentless spread of trust in money, what Harari calls the gospel of gold, did create over time essentially a single monetary zone spanning the globe, connecting economies in unprecedented ways.
Yeah.
That's the unifying part. But the darker side is the argument that money, while connecting us economically, can also corrode other kinds of human values and relationships. As trust becomes increasingly invested not in specific people or communities or shared sacred values, but rather in money itself and the impersonal, often abstract systems that support it, like banks or governments, well, something gets lost.
Right, what?
We start trusting the currency the stranger offers, not necessarily the stranger themselves. This can lead to a heartless marketplace, as the sources put it, where community bonds, family obligations, religious principles, even patriotism can potentially be trumped or undermined by cold, hard cash and purely economic calculations. It can foster greed, betrayal, and a sense that everything, even human relationships, has a price. So the story of money is this constant, complex interplay between its power to enable cooperation and its potential to corrupt human connection.
That makes sense. A double-edged sword. Okay, so money was one great unifier. What was the second one you mentioned? Empires.
Yes, empires. And our sources make a really bold claim here, that empire has actually been the world's most common form of political organization for the last 2,500 years, much more common than, say, independent city-states or small tribal kingdoms.
Wow. Most common. We tend to think of empires as exceptions, maybe.
But historically, vast, multi-ethnic, culturally diverse political units ruled by a single dominant group or center have been incredibly prevalent and remarkably stable, often lasting for centuries. And despite their often brutal methods of conquest and control, they played an absolutely critical role in unifying vast populations and spreading common cultures, laws, languages, and ideas over huge areas.
How did they do that? Weren't they mostly about imposing their own culture?
Often, yes, initially. But successful empires were also immense melting pots. Over time, they tended to absorb and blend the cultures of the peoples they conquered, creating new hybrid syntheses. Look at the Roman Empire. They conquered Greece, but ended up deeply absorbing Greek philosophy, art, and literature. And eventually, though it took centuries, they granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free subjects across the empire, integrating Gauls, Spaniards, Syrians, Egyptians into the Roman system, even allowing them to become emperors.
So they mixed things up.
Absolutely. Or consider the Arab-Islamic conquest starting in the 7th century. They created a vast empire, but the resulting vibrant, cosmopolitan Islamic culture that flourished wasn't just Arab. It incorporated and was hugely enriched by Persian, Egyptian, Syrian, Byzantine, and Indian traditions. And this synthesized culture was then enthusiastically adopted and further developed by non-Arab peoples like Turks and Berbers long after the original Arab Empire itself had fragmented. A classic example. For over 2,000 years, waves of conquest integrated incredibly diverse ethnic and cultural groups, often dismissed initially as barbarians, into a singular evolving imperial Chinese culture. Over time, many of these distinct groups were assimilated and effectively became what we now understand as Han Chinese. Empires, often unintentionally, acted as massive cultural homogenizers and unifiers.
So even as they conquered, they assimilated and blended. What kind of lasting legacies did these empires leave behind, especially in places that eventually broke free from imperial rule?
The legacies are incredibly complex, layered, and often quite contradictory. On the one hand, empires were frequently built on violence, exploitation, and the suppression of local identities. On the other hand, the very wealth, stability, and interconnectedness they created often enabled incredible bursts of intellectual, artistic, and architectural achievement. Think of the Taj Mahal, built under the Mughal Empire in India, or the great philosophical schools of Athens under Roman influence, or Haydn's symphonies, funded by aristocratic patrons whose wealth was tied into the Habsburg imperial system.
So cultural flourishing funded by empire.
Often, yes. And beyond high culture, empires spread common administrative structures, legal frameworks, standardized weights and measures, and crucially common languages, lingua francas like Latin, Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, French, English, that facilitated communication and trade across vast, diverse regions long after the empires themselves collapsed.
The India example you mentioned.
It's perhaps a compelling modern example of this complex legacy. India fought a long, often bitter struggle for independence from the British Empire. Yet, upon gaining independence in 1947, what political system did it adopt? Western-style parliamentary democracy. What became a key lingua franca for national communication and administration? English. What are some of the most popular national pastimes? Cricket and drinking tea, chai, both directly inherited from the British. These shared frameworks, however imposed, often provided a foundation for unity and state building in the post-colonial era, paradoxically using the tools of the former empire.
And this whole process of unification, driven by money and empires. You're suggesting it's not even finished, right? Our sources seem to hint that history is still moving relentlessly towards unity, maybe even towards a kind of single global empire, though not in the old-fashioned conquering sense.
That's precisely the argument presented. The idea is that the underlying logic of history, especially in the modern era, pushes towards greater integration. If we accept the idea of universal human rights, that people in Sweden, Indonesia, and Nigeria all deserve the same fundamental protections, then logically, a single global political authority might eventually be seen as the most effective way to guarantee those rights, transcending the limitations and rivalries of nation-states.
So a world government.
Maybe not a formal world government in the traditional sense, with a single capital and flag. The global empire being forged before our eyes, as Harari puts it, is perhaps more subtle. It's not ruled by a particular state or ethnicity. Instead, it's increasingly governed by a sort of multi-ethnic, transnational elite, a network of interconnected business leaders, engineers, scientists, academics, artists, managers who share a common global culture, often speaking English, frequenting similar airports and hotels, consuming similar media, and common interests that often transcend national borders.
Like Davos, man.
Kind of, yeah. Think about the global financial system, the international scientific community, global supply chains, even the reach of Hollywood movies or Premier League football. These forces operate on a global scale, often disregarding or weaving through traditional state boundaries. This relentless march towards unity, driven by economic interdependence, shared challenges like climate change, and increasingly powerful communication technologies, is presented as a profound ongoing trend shaping our present and future, whether we consciously recognize it as an empire or not.
That's a really powerful and, for some people, probably quite unsettling vision of where things might be heading, this kind of creeping global convergence. Okay, let's accelerate even further now into the really profound, game-changing shifts of just the last 500 years or so, starting with the scientific revolution. And again, our sources use this provocative framing, calling it a revolution of ignorance. Let's really unpack that. What was the true nature of the scientific revolution, and why is it, kind of ironically, seen as a revolution based on not knowing?
Right. The scientific revolution, really taking off around 1500 AD onwards, was revolutionary precisely because it was built on foundations fundamentally different from the pre-modern knowledge traditions that had dominated human societies for millennia, traditions like Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism. It rests on three interconnected pillars, none of which were central before.
Okay, what's the first pillar?
The first, and arguably the most crucial, is the willing admission of ignorance. Modern science starts from the assumption that we don't know everything about the most important questions. And, even more radically, accepts that what we think we know right now could very well be proven wrong tomorrow by new evidence or better theories.
So, no absolute certainty, nothing sacred.
Exactly. No concept, no theory, not even the most cherished ones, are considered absolutely final or beyond challenge and revision. This is a massive departure from most pre-modern traditions, which generally assume that all the truly important knowledge about the world and our place in it was already known, either revealed in sacred texts like the Bible or the Quran, or discovered by wise ancestors in the past. They focused on preserving and interpreting existing knowledge, not actively seeking fundamentally new discoveries based on the idea that current knowledge might be incomplete or wrong. This humility, this embrace of we don't know, was the revolutionary spark.
Okay, so it starts with acknowledging ignorance. That's huge.
Right.
What are the other two pillars that built on that foundation?
The second pillar is the centrality of observation in mathematics. Having admitted we don't know, modern science seeks to obtain new knowledge by systematically gathering empirical observations, looking carefully at the world, conducting experiments, and then, crucially, using mathematical tools to connect these observations into comprehensive theories that can not only explain what we see, but also make predictions.
Like Newton.
Newton is a classic example. His laws of motion, expressed in mathematical equations, didn't just explain why apples fall. They could predict the future positions of planets with incredible accuracy. Or think about Edmund Halley, Newton's contemporary. He used birth and death records, observations, and mathematical calculations to create the first actuarial tables, accurately predicting mortality rates. This formed the basis of the modern life insurance industry. Even today, if you study psychology or sociology, you have to learn statistics, mathematics to analyze observations about human behavior and society.
Okay, admit ignorance, observe and measure, use math. What's the third pillar?
The third pillar is the relentless drive to use this new knowledge to acquire new powers, primarily through the development of new technologies. Modern science isn't usually content just to understand the world. It aims to change it, to solve problems, to gain capabilities we didn't have before. From medicine curing diseases, to engineers building bridges, to physicists unlocking nuclear energy. This focus on practical application, on gaining power, is a key driver. So you see why it's called a revolution of ignorance. The profound, empowering discovery was realizing just how much we didn't know, and that by admitting that ignorance and using observation and math, we could gain entirely new knowledge and unprecedented power over the world.
That makes perfect sense now. Okay, so this new approach, curious, mathematical, power-seeking, how quickly did it actually translate into real-world impact? Did societies immediately jump on board and start transforming?
Actually, initially, it was surprisingly slow. The impact wasn't immediate or obvious for the first couple of centuries. Take gunpowder, for instance. It was invented in China way back in the 9th century, but it took something like 600 years for cannons to evolve and become a truly decisive factor on European battlefields, significantly changing warfare.
600 years, that's a long time.
A very long time. Scientific insights didn't automatically translate into technological dominance overnight. The situation only really began to change significantly in the 15th and 16th centuries, and even then, it took maybe another 200 years after that before governments, military leaders, and business people consistently and strategically started investing large sums of money in scientific research, specifically because they believed it could yield new powers, military advantages, economic profits, political dominance.
So what changed? Why did they start investing?
It was largely the dawning realization, fueled by early successes and the rise of capitalism, that science and technology could be reliable engines of progress and power. It was the forging of that really tight, often mutually beneficial, sometimes uncomfortable bond between science, politics, and economics that truly unleashed science's transformative potential. When scientific discovery became tightly linked to profit motives, capitalism, and state power, military and political ambitions, especially during and after the Industrial Revolution, things really took off at an exponential rate, rapidly reshaping the entire planet.
And this new scientific mindset, tied to power and economics, also seems to have brought with it a completely radical new idea, the very concept of progress. The belief that humanity isn't stuck in cycles or declining from a golden age, but can actually solve all its problems, overcome limitations, improve endlessly. That feels like a massive psychological shift from pre-modern thinking.
It absolutely is. It's a fundamental shift in worldview. Most pre-modern cultures didn't really believe in progress in the way we do now. They might have believed in individual salvation or maintaining cosmic balance, but the idea that human knowledge, technology, and societal well-being could and should continuously improve indefinitely, that was pretty rare. They often looked back to a golden age or believed the world was stagnant or even slowly deteriorating.
So what's the ultimate expression of this modern belief in progress?
Our sources argue it manifests most dramatically in what they call the Gilgamesh Project, named, of course, after the ancient Sumerian king from the epic poem who desperately sought immortality after his friend died.
The quest to defeat death.
Exactly. For modern science, death isn't seen as an inevitable metaphysical destiny ordained by gods or fate. It's viewed increasingly as merely a technical problem.
A technical problem, like a faulty engine.
Pretty much. A heart attack, that's a pump failure. Cancer, uncontrolled cell growth, a software glitch in the genetic code, old age itself, a gradual system breakdown. And the core belief of the scientific progressive mindset is that every technical problem has a technical solution, eventually. We just need to figure it out.
So fix the machine.
If a heart fails, figure out how to repair it, replace it with a transplant, or build an artificial one. If cancer cells run wild, develop drugs or radiation or immunotherapies to target and kill them. Our best scientific minds aren't primarily focused on finding philosophical meaning in death anymore. They're intensely busy investigating the complex physiological, hormonal, genetic, and cellular systems responsible for disease and aging, fully confident that these processes can eventually be understood, manipulated, slowed down, or even reversed.
And when you look back at history, at how common death was, especially for the young, and compare it to today, the progress made by this Gilgamesh project so far is just staggering. It really puts into perspective how successful this approach has been, at least in extending life.
The transformation is almost impossible for us to truly grasp emotionally today. Our sources give some stark examples. Think about King Richard the Lionheart of England, one of the most powerful men in 12th century Europe. He died from gangrene that set in after he was hit in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege. A relatively small wound, but the infection couldn't be stopped. Dead in days.
Unthinkable today, mostly.
Or consider another English king, Edward I, and his wife Eleanor of Castile around the late 13th century. They were a healthy, wealthy, powerful royal couple. They had 16 children together. 16. How many survived into adulthood?
I dread to ask.
Only 6. 10 of their 16 children died young, mostly in infancy or early childhood. Only 3 lived past the age of 40. It's almost impossible for parents in developed countries today to imagine experiencing that level of constant, profound loss as normal.
Just devastating.
And now, genetic engineers have already managed to significantly extend, even double, the average lifespan of simple organisms like Caenorhabditis elegans worms, just by tweaking a single gene. The optimism for doing something similar eventually for humans is palpable in some scientific circles. Nanotechnology researchers talk about building microscopic robots to repair cells from within, like a bionic immune system. Cryogenics companies offer to freeze bodies or brains, gambling on a future where technology might exist to revive and cure them. The conquest of death, or at least its radical postponement, is no longer just a mythological quest. It's a serious, funded, scientific objective for some.
It sounds like science isn't just intertwined with this idea of progress and defeating death, but also deeply, intrinsically connected back to those empires we talked about earlier. That drive to explore, know, and control seems linked.
Absolutely. You really can't disentangle the rise of modern science, especially in its early formative centuries, from the simultaneous explosion of European imperialism. There was something unique about Europe from roughly 1500 to 1950, this unparalleled and insatiable ambition to explore and conquer the entire globe.
Compared to, say, China.
Exactly. China, for example, had incredible naval expeditions under Zheng He in the early 15th century, reaching Africa. But they didn't follow up with conquest or colonization. They mostly stayed focused on their known world, the Middle Kingdom and its immediate neighbors. European powers, in contrast, developed this relentless drive to map, claim, and exploit lands utterly unknown to them previously.
And science got pulled into that.
It became an integral part of the imperial project. European voyages of discovery weren't just military or economic ventures. They were also huge scientific expeditions. Think of Captain Cook's voyages, carrying botanists, astronomers, artists to document everything they found. British officers and administrators stationed in India didn't just rule, they became pioneering archaeologists, uncovering ancient cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, giving India back parts of its lost history.
Like Rawlinson deciphering cuneiform.
Precisely. Henry Rawlinson was a British Army officer stationed in Persia when he risked his life climbing cliffs to copy the Behistun inscription, which became the key to deciphering ancient Mesopotamian scripts. Or William Jones, a judge appointed to the British court in Calcutta. He became fascinated by Sanskrit, realized its deep structural connections to Greek and Latin, and basically founded the entire field of comparative Indo-European linguistics. These scientific endeavors often provided powerful ideological justification for empire. They allowed the imperial powers to portray themselves not just as conquerors, but as agents of progress, bringing enlightenment, order, and modern knowledge, like medicine or archaeology, to supposedly backward or stagnant societies, even as they were extracting resources and imposing foreign rule. Science and empire became mutually reinforcing.
Wow. That really complicates the picture of pure, disinterested scientific discovery, which brings up a really important question you touched on. Who actually gets to decide what science gets done? Is it just driven by pure curiosity? Or are there other, maybe more powerful forces shaping the scientific agenda?
That's a critical and often quite uncomfortable question to ask. While countless individual scientists are undoubtedly motivated by sheer intellectual curiosity, a genuine passion for discovery, and a desire to benefit humanity, They rarely get to dictate the overall direction of science, especially when big money is involved.
So who does?
By and large, the scientific agenda, what gets researched, what technologies get developed, what problems get prioritized, is overwhelmingly shaped and funded by political, economic, and sometimes even religious interests.
Can you give an example?
Our sources use a great simple example. Imagine there's limited funding available for research on cows. Which project is more likely to get millions of dollars? Research into finding a cure for a common cow udder disease that reduces milk yields, or research into understanding the subjective emotional world and psychological well-being of cows?
Probably the udder disease.
Almost certainly. Why? Because the powerful dairy industry has a massive economic interest in increasing milk production. They will lobby governments, fund university departments, and ensure that research directly serving their bottom line gets prioritized. It's not necessarily about which question is more scientifically interesting, ethically profound, or potentially beneficial to the cows themselves. It's about which research serves existing power structures and economic interests. This shows how external forces heavily influence what knowledge we pursue, which problems we deem worthy of solving, and ultimately, what kind of future science helps to build.
That's a pretty sobering thought, really. It makes you look at scientific breakthroughs in a slightly different light. Okay, let's move on to the next massive accelerator, the Industrial Revolution. This really transformed daily life and the planet itself by unleashing this unprecedented combination of cheap and abundant energy and cheap and abundant raw materials.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, kicking off in Britain in the late 18th century, was a complete game changer. It fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with energy and materials, unleashing productivity on a scale never before imagined.
What were the key breakthroughs?
Well, the steam engine is the iconic one. Initially developed just to pump water out of flooded coal mines, it was quickly adapted by figures like James Watt to power machinery, especially in textile factories. This transformed industries, making Britain the workshop of the world. Then, much later, came the understanding of mass energy conversion, famously captured in Einstein's EMCMCA. This theoretical insight eventually led to nuclear power and, of course, nuclear weapons, fundamentally altering global power balances and giving humanity access to immense energy locked within atoms.
And the internal combustion engine.
Right, that revolutionized transportation, industry, and warfare, turning petroleum from a curiosity into liquid political power, reshaping geopolitics around oil access. And don't forget crucial chemical breakthroughs like the Haber-Bosch process, developed in the early 20th century.
What did that do?
It figured out how to artificially fix nitrogen from the air to create synthetic fertilizers on an industrial scale. This single process is arguably responsible for feeding billions of people alive today by dramatically increasing agricultural yields and preventing the widespread famines that Malthus had predicted were inevitable. The Industrial Revolution was essentially about humanity learning to tap into vast, previously inaccessible stores of energy, first coal, then oil, then natural gas, then nuclear, and using that energy to manipulate matter in increasingly complex ways. It created an era of unprecedented material abundance, for some at least.
So on one side, incredible productivity, feeding billions, material abundance. But just like with agriculture, there seems to be a dark side. Our sources talk about the brutal practices and the feeling of life becoming like a conveyor belt, especially again for animals caught up in this industrial system.
Absolutely. What's truly fascinating and deeply disturbing is how that relentless drive for industrial efficiency and mass production, which brought so many benefits to humans, often completely ignored and continues to ignore the subjective experience and well-being of the non-human animals caught within the system. Industrial agriculture is really the agricultural revolution put on industrial steroids.
How so?
It takes the logic of treating animals as resources, which started with domestication, and applies the principles of factory production lines to them. It treats living creatures possessing complex emotional worlds as if they were machines, designed solely for producing meat, milk, or eggs as efficiently and cheaply as possible.
We talked about the calves and chicks.
Exactly. Those examples, calves confined in crates, male chicks shredded, are direct consequences of prioritizing maximum output and minimum cost over any consideration of the animal's basic biological or psychological needs for movement, social interaction, or freedom from pain and fear. Sows, confined in gestation crates so small they can't even turn around, chickens packed into battery cages, cattle fattened in feedlots. While these practices maximize human productivity and provide cheap food for billions, they come at an immense, often hidden cost in terms of animal suffering. It's arguably one of the biggest ethical blind spots created by our pursuit of industrial efficiency.
And all the stuff pouring out of the factories, this sheer abundance of products, It didn't just happen in a vacuum. It fueled another massive revolution, right? The rise of consumerism, which fundamentally shaped modern economies and societies.
Absolutely. You can't have mass production without mass consumption. As factories started churning out this unprecedented avalanche of products, textiles, tools, processed foods, household goods, a new problem arose. How do you convince people to buy all this stuff, especially things they might not have even known they needed before?
So you needed to create demand.
Exactly. This led directly to the rise and triumph of the consumerist ethic, a whole new ideology that actively encourages indulgence, acquisition, and overconsumption. In this worldview, traditional virtues like frugality, thrift, and simplicity are recast not as virtues, but almost as personality flaws, as a disease to be cured.
A disease, frugality.
Think about advertising. It constantly tells us we deserve more, we need the latest thing, we should treat ourselves. Our source quotes a typical modern cereal box slogan. Sometimes you need a treat, sometimes you need a little extra energy, times when you've just got to have something right now. It's an ideology built on promoting instant gratification, associating happiness with purchasing, and making people feel perpetually dissatisfied or incomplete without the next new product.
And the capitalist system benefits twice over, right?
Ah, yes. The brilliant trick Harari mentions. First, convince people to eat too much through advertising cheap processed food. Then convince them to buy expensive diet products or gym memberships to lose the weight they gained. You profit from both the overconsumption and the cure.
So we end up with this incredibly powerful dynamic. The capitalist-consumerist feedback loop. The capitalists, the elite, are supposed to be frugal and reinvest their profits to make even more stuff. The rest of us, the masses, are encouraged to give free rein to their cravings and buy all that stuff. It's even described as maybe the first religion in history whose followers actually do what they are asked to do.
It's a really powerful and insightful analogy, isn't it? In previous eras, you had different ethics. Maybe religious ethics emphasizing piety and charity, or aristocratic ethics emphasizing honor and lavish display, but not necessarily endless reinvestment for growth. This new combined ethic, this new religion of capitalism and consumerism, has a very clear set of commandments.
Which are?
For the rich, the supreme commandment is invest. Don't hoard your money. Reinvest profits to expand production, create new products, generate more wealth. For the rest of us, the masses, the commandment is buy. Consume more, indulge your desires, replace things often, believe that happiness can be purchased.
And the promised reward.
The promise is paradise, but a paradise here on earth. It's often depicted vividly on television screens, in movies, and advertisements, a life of endless comfort, convenience, novelty, pleasure, and material abundance. And unlike the promises of traditional religions about an afterlife, this consumerist paradise seems attainable, tangible, constantly reinforced by the products themselves. That's perhaps why its followers are so diligent. The system delivers, at least partially and temporarily, on its promise of material gratification, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of production and consumption that drives the modern global economy.
Wow. We've covered such immense transformations, cosmic origins, cognitive leaps, farming tracks, empires, science, industry, consumerism. It's dizzying. Now let's try to grapple with some of the really surprising paradoxes of the modern era, the world created by all these revolutions. So what does all this mean for how we actually live today? And the big question looming over everything, are we actually any happier as a result of all this progress?
It's the crucial question, isn't it? The modern era is really defined by what our sources call permanent revolution. Change isn't occasional anymore. It's constant, accelerating, woven into the very fabric of our lives. Social structures, family life, technology, politics, everything is in flux.
And population growth.
Absolutely dramatic. We're pushing 8 billion sapiens now, compared to maybe only 500 million back in 1500 AD. Humanity has truly taken over the planet, converting vast ecosystems into resources for ourselves, often driving other species to extinction. It's an unprecedented biological success from one perspective.
But here's a paradox. Despite headlines often filled with conflict, you're saying there's been a surprising decline of violence. How can that be?
It sounds completely counterintuitive, I know, especially watching the news. But statistically, looking at the long sweep of history and global trends, the likelihood of an average person dying from human violence, whether war, terrorism, or crime, is significantly lower today than in most previous eras, including the foraging period.
Lower than foragers? Really?
Yes. For example, our source points out that in 2002, a year with significant conflicts and the aftermath of 9/11, far more people worldwide died from suicide, around 873,000, than died from war, 172,000, and violent crime, 569,000 combined. More people kill themselves than are killed by soldiers, terrorists, and criminals put together. And deaths from car accidents also dwarf deaths from violence in most parts of the world. It suggests that for many societies, especially stable states, the ancient law of the jungle, the constant threat of violence, might actually be receding. We're seeing not just the absence of war between major powers, a cold peace, but potentially a real peace based on deeper structural changes.
Okay, that is totally counterintuitive but fascinating if the data supports it. So why? Why has international war, at least between major powers, become so much less appealing or common than it used to be? What's driving this surprising decline in large-scale violence?
There are several key reasons, mostly boiling down to changes in economics and politics. A huge factor is that the nature of wealth itself has changed. In the past, wealth was primarily material. Agricultural land, gold mines, maybe slaves.
Yeah.
You could conquer territory and physically seize that wealth.
Right, plunder.
Exactly. But today, wealth is increasingly based on knowledge, technology, complex organizational structures, and human capital. Think of the value of Silicon Valley. It's not in the land itself, but in the engineers' brains, the software code, the patents, the corporate structures. You can't easily conquer that kind of wealth by invading California. Knowledge walks away.
So war doesn't pay like it used to.
For major powers, often not. Foreign trade and international investment are now far more profitable routes to prosperity than conquest, and those things depend entirely on peace and stability. War between major economies, like, say, the U.S. and China, would be economically devastating for both sides, disrupting supply chains, destroying markets, wiping out investments. The economic incentives have shifted dramatically towards cooperation, or at least managed competition, rather than all-out war.
And the political culture.
There's also been a significant shift there. The rise of international norms against conquest, the influence of international organizations, and that emerging global empire of shared interests among elites we talked about. All these things make launching major wars much harder politically and ideologically than it was in, say, 1914. Peace has become, in many ways, the default condition, and war the costly exception, at least between the world's most powerful states.
But this era of unprecedented material progress, this relative peace, this interconnectedness, it seems to have come at a significant social cost. Our sources talk a lot about the disintegration of traditional bonds like family and local community structure.
Indeed. It's a central paradox of modernity. Over the last couple centuries, the traditional roles of the family and local community providing education, healthcare, economic support, social connection, even basic security, have been increasingly taken over by two huge impersonal entities.
Yeah.
State and the market.
The government and corporations, basically.
Right. On the one hand, this offered incredible liberation for individuals. You were no longer completely bound by the often oppressive norms, rigid expectations, and limited opportunities of your birth family or village. You could, in theory, choose your own path, your profession, your partner, your identity, relying on state services or market opportunities.
That sounds like progress.
It is in many ways, but the flip side was often a profound sense of alienation, loneliness, and vulnerability. People lost those tight-knit, immediate, face-to-face support networks of traditional communities and instead became dependent on vast impersonal forces, large corporations dictating employment, distant government bureaucracies providing welfare or pensions, mass media shaping opinions.
So freedom, but also isolation.
Exactly. A sense of being a small cog in a huge, indifferent machine. And to fill this emotional void, this longing for belonging that family and community used to satisfy, new kinds of imagined communities arose and became incredibly powerful.
Like what?
Primarily nationalism, the imagined community of the nation, uniting millions of strangers who will never meet but feel a deep bond based on shared symbols, history, and identity. And consumerism, the imagined communities created by brands and lifestyles, allowing people to signal their identity and find belonging through shared patterns of consumption. These step in to provide a sense of identity and connection that was lost when traditional structures weakened.
And that brings us back to the ultimate paradox, the really big question. After all of this escaping famine, conquering disease, building global networks, achieving material abundance beyond the wildest dreams of our ancestors, are we actually happier? Does all this increased capability, all this progress, automatically translate into greater subjective well-being?
The standard progressive account of history basically assumes the answer is yes. Since humans have consistently used their growing power to alleviate suffering, like hunger and disease, and fulfill desires, like comfort and entertainment, surely we must be happier than our ancestors who lacked these things. It seems logical. But our sources, drawing on psychology and biology, really challenge this assumption. New abilities, new technologies, even greater wealth and health don't necessarily guarantee a better subjective experience of life. Why? Well, one major perspective comes from the biochemistry argument.
Okay, what's that?
This view suggests that our feelings of happiness, pleasure, contentment are fundamentally governed by complex neurochemical systems in our brains, involving neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. Our subjective well-being isn't just a reflection of external conditions. It's largely determined by our internal biochemistry.
So it's all just brain chemistry.
To a large extent, according to this view. And crucially, this biochemical system seems to be shaped significantly by genetics. Each person might have a kind of genetically determined set point for happiness, like a thermostat. External events, winning the lottery, suffering an accident might cause temporary fluctuations, but our mood tends to return to its typical baseline level over time. Our internal mental air conditioning system, as Harari calls it, has a limited freedom of movement within these predetermined emotional boundaries.
Like, some people are just naturally more cheerful, others more prone to melancholy, regardless of what happens.
Exactly. And this perspective helps explain why huge societal changes don't always lead to corresponding leaps in reported happiness. It also explains why things like antidepressant drugs, like Prozac, which affects serotonin levels, can sometimes have a significant impact on mood, independent of external circumstances. Or why Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, with its chemically induced happiness drug Soma, feels so chillingly plausible from this biochemical perspective. It implies that simply changing external conditions, more money, better health, more freedom, might have only a limited and often temporary effect on our deep-seated levels of happiness.
Wow. Okay, so if happiness is primarily about our internal biochemistry, our genetic set point, does that mean the pursuit of external things, like finding meaning in life, is irrelevant? Or does meaning itself just become another kind of, well, collective delusion we use to maybe trick our biochemistry into feeling better?
That's a really crucial distinction, and it dives deep into philosophy. The purely biochemical view often seems to clash with another powerful idea about happiness, that it comes from finding a sense of meaning and purpose in one's life.
Right, feeling like your life matters, that it's part of something bigger.
Exactly. And people throughout history have found immense meaning and presumably subjective satisfaction in all sorts of belief systems, many of which we might now consider collective delusions. Think about a medieval peasant who truly believed their suffering on earth guaranteed them eternal bliss in paradise, or a soldier dying for the glory of their nation, convinced their sacrifice had profound meaning. If these beliefs, these shared fictions, were genuinely held, they could provide a powerful sense of purpose and contentment, even amidst objective hardship.
So does that mean, well, it's an uncomfortable thought, but if happiness depends on finding meaning, and meaning often relies on believing in these shared stories or delusions, do we need to, as Harari asks, delude ourselves more effectively to be happier?
It's a provocative and unsettling question, isn't it? Our modern liberal culture tends to place immense value on individual subjective feelings. The mantra is often, if it feels good, do it. We assume our feelings are the ultimate guide to what is good and meaningful.
Yeah, trust your feelings.
But is that always reliable? Harari uses the example. If a psychologist surveys heroin addicts and they overwhelmingly report that they only feel truly happy when they're high, does that mean heroin is the key to happiness for everyone? Most of us would instinctively say no. Our feelings can mislead us. They can be fleeting, dependent on temporary chemical highs, or tied to beliefs that might not actually serve our long-term well-being. This pushes us to consider alternative perspectives on happiness and suffering. Perspectives that don't necessarily equate happiness solely with pleasant feelings or the fulfillment of desires, like the Buddhist tradition.
What's truly fascinating here is how this ancient wisdom, like the Buddhist perspective, seems to fundamentally challenge our modern, often liberal assumptions about the supreme authority of our own subjective feelings. It makes you question the very foundation of how we pursue happiness today.
It really does. The Buddhist perspective, in stark contrast to the modern Western emphasis on maximizing pleasant feelings and minimizing unpleasant ones, offers a radically different diagnosis and cure for human suffering. Buddhism argues that suffering doesn't primarily arise from external events like pain, loss, or injustice, nor from failing to achieve pleasant feelings. Rather, suffering arises from our internal reaction to those feelings specifically, from our constant craving for pleasant sensations and our intense aversion to unpleasant ones.
So it's the chasing and the running away that causes the problem.
Exactly. We're caught on this hedonic treadmill, constantly chasing the next pleasant feeling, which is inevitably temporary, and desperately trying to avoid the next unpleasant one, which is also inevitable. This endless cycle of craving and aversion, according to Buddhism, is the root of our dissatisfaction, anxiety, and suffering.
So what's the solution then?
The path to true serenity, to lasting liberation from suffering, nirvana, isn't about achieving a permanent state of blissful feeling. It's about understanding the true nature of feelings, that they are all impermanent, arising and passing like waves. It's about training the mind, through practices like meditation, to observe these feelings without getting attached, without craving the pleasant ones or hating the unpleasant ones. It's about cultivating acceptance, equanimity, and living fully in the present moment, understanding the impermanent nature of all phenomena, including ourselves.
So understanding reality rather than just chasing pleasure.
Precisely. It's about seeing things as they truly are, including the nature of our own minds and desires, rather than being constantly driven by illusions and attachments. This ancient perspective suggests that our entire modern pursuit of happiness through external achievements, material accumulation, or even finding meaning in potentially illusory narratives might be fundamentally misguided if it doesn't address the underlying mechanisms of craving and aversion within our own minds. It really makes you wonder if, despite all our incredible scientific and technological progress, we truly understand ourselves or the nature of happiness any better than people did thousands of years ago.
Wow. From the deepest insights of ancient wisdom to the absolute cutting edge of modern science, we are now standing on the brink of something utterly unprecedented, a future that might not just reshape our societies, but reshape the very definition of what it means to be human. Okay, here's where it gets really wild. What happens when we stop just adapting to our environment and start actively, directly engineering ourselves, engineering life itself? What does the future of Homo sapiens even look like then?
We are definitely entering an entirely new era, moving beyond just understanding life to actively designing and creating it. The possibilities are staggering and, frankly, quite unnerving. We're already talking seriously about things like de-extinction, using genetic engineering and cloning techniques to bring back species that vanished long ago, like woolly mammoths.
Bringing back mammoths? Serially?
There are active projects working on it, using preserved DNA and elephant surrogates.
Yeah.
And it goes further. Professor George Church at Harvard, a leading geneticist, famously suggested, after the Neanderthal genome was sequenced, that we could potentially reconstruct Neanderthal DNA, implant it into a modern human egg cell, and use a surrogate mother to, theoretically, birth the first Neanderthal child in 30,000 years.
Ooh.
He estimated it might cost around $30 million. And apparently some women have already volunteered to be surrogates if the project ever went ahead. It's not just about restoring the past, it's about actively creating new forms of life, or recreating old ones, based on our own designs and desires. The ethical and biological implications are just immense.
Okay, that's engineering other species.
Mm-hmm.
What about engineering humans? The whole idea of bionic people, cyborgs. That always felt like pure science fiction. But you're saying it's becoming real. What are the possibilities there, and what does it mean for being human?
It absolutely is becoming reality, step by step. We already see pioneers like Jesse Sullivan and Claudia Mitchell who lost limbs and were fitted with early versions of bionic arms. These weren't just passive prosthetics. They could be controlled, to some degree, by nerve signals from the user's own bodies.
Mind-controlled limbs.
Essentially, yes, reading nerve impulses.
Yeah.
And the technology is advancing incredibly rapidly. Scientists are developing much more sophisticated bionic limbs that can not only be controlled more intuitively, but can also send sensory information like pressure, texture, temperature back to the user's brain, creating a much more integrated sense of touch. The line between organic limb and artificial limb is blurring.
So where does it lead?
Cyborgs. That's the term, yes. A cyborg is simply an organism that combines organic and inorganic body parts.
Mm-hmm.
And as these inorganic parts become more advanced, more integrated, more capable perhaps than our natural parts, well, the very definition of human starts to fray. Imagine a future cyborg with enhanced senses, direct neural interface with computers, maybe even cognitive augmentation. Would such a being still be considered human? Or would it become something completely different, as Harari speculates? An entity whose experiences, thoughts, maybe even consciousness, are fundamentally incomprehensible to us baseline humans. It forces us to confront that question. Where does the human end and something else begin?
And then there's the even more mind-bending possibility, moving beyond biology altogether. inorganic life, digital minds. And can we really create consciousness just from computer code, or maybe upload our own?
This takes us into truly profound philosophical and existential waters. We already see a kind of primitive, non-organic evolution happening in cyberspace, right? Computer viruses and worms mutate, adapt, replicate, compete for resources within digital ecosystems. Researchers in fields like artificial life and genetic programming are actively exploring how complex adaptive behaviors can emerge from simple computational rules mimicking biological evolution.
Okay, but that's just code. What about actual minds?
That's the ultimate leap. What if we could perfectly map and simulate a human brain inside a supercomputer? Projects like the Human Brain Project have aimed, perhaps overambitiously, to do just that. If they succeeded, would that simulation be conscious? Would it feel like you?
Would it be you?
Exactly. If you could back up your brain to a hard drive and run it on a laptop, as the thought experiment goes, would your laptop be able to think and feel just like a Sapiens? If yes, is it really you, or just a perfect copy? And if you hit delete on that digital mind, have you committed murder? These aren't just technical questions anymore. They challenge our deepest assumptions about identity, consciousness, life, and death. The very definition of what constitutes a living creature or a person is being fundamentally questioned by these potential future technologies.
These potential futures, engineering life, creating cyborgs, digital minds, they throw up absolutely immense ethical, social, and political dilemmas that, honestly, we seem barely equipped to even think about, let alone resolve. What are some of the most pressing concerns that emerge as we head down this path?
You're right. The ethical landscape is shifting incredibly fast, maybe faster than our ability to navigate it. Think about the more near-term implications. What happens when insurance companies routinely demand access to your full DNA scan? Will they deny coverage or charge exorbitant premiums if you have a genetic predisposition to certain diseases, or maybe even personality traits deemed risky, like recklessness?
Genetic discrimination.
Exactly. Or what about employment? Will employers start favoring candidates with superior genetic profiles for certain jobs? Could corporations patent entire genetically engineered species that they create in the lab, effectively owning new forms of life? These are huge issues already bubbling up.
But there's an even scarier possibility mentioned.
Yes, perhaps the most terrifying long-term risk highlighted in our sources is that the historical pretensions of the upper classes, the belief held by aristocracies or elites throughout history that they were inherently superior to the common masses, could potentially become objective biological reality through access to new medical and genetic technologies. If the wealthy can afford biological enhancements that the poor cannot advance genetic engineering to boost intelligence or health, sophisticated cognitive enhancing brain-computer interfaces, radical life extension treatments, superior bionic parts, then the gap between rich and poor could widen from merely socioeconomic to fundamentally biological. We could see the emergence of biologically distinct upper and lower classes, or even different human species. This isn't just science fiction anymore. It implies a future where social inequality could become biologically entrenched, creating divisions far deeper and more permanent than anything we've seen before. A biological caste system.
It's almost too much to comprehend. We've traced this incredible arc, Homo sapiens, starting as just another insignificant animal on the African savanna, and now potentially standing at the threshold of becoming, well, something else entirely. Architects of life, engineers of ourselves, maybe even creators of our own successors. So what does this all ultimately mean for the very definition of Homo sapiens itself as we move into this uncertain future?
It brings us face to face with what our sources call the Frankenstein myth, but interpreted in a new way. It's not just the simple cautionary tale about playing God and being punished for hubris. It's a deeper, more profound confrontation with the reality that our own technological creations, driven by our relentless pursuit of knowledge and power, might soon make Homo sapiens, as we've known ourselves for the last 70,000 years, obsolete.
Obsolete. Replaced.
Potentially, yes. The future masters of the world, if we continue down the path of biological and artificial intelligence engineering, might not be humans as we understand the term. They could be completely different beings, possessing cognitive abilities, emotional landscapes, forms of consciousness, lifespans, and physical capabilities so far beyond ours that the gap would be far greater than the gap between us and the Neanderthals.
More different from us than we are from Neanderthals.
Exactly. We and Neanderthals are at least variations on the same human theme, members of the same biological genus. Our potential successors, whether biologically engineered posthumans or artificial intelligences, could be something truly alien, perhaps even godlike in their powers relative to us. It's about the potential end of Homo sapiens, not necessarily through extinction, but through transcendence or replacement by our own creations.
And this brings us to the ultimate, most profound, maybe most unsettling question posed by Harari at the end of Sapiens. A question that kind of reframes the entire challenge of our godlike technological power.
Indeed. Given that we might soon have the power not just to engineer bodies and brains, but potentially even to engineer our desires, our preferences, our very motivations, the crucial question we face is no longer simply, what do we want to become? Because that question assumes our wants themselves are fixed, authentic, coming from some deep inner self.
Right, but if we can engineer the wanting.
Exactly. Then the real, deeper, more fundamental question becomes, what do we want to want? If we could choose our desires, if we could program our own motivations, what desires should we choose? What motivation should we program into ourselves or into our successors? This raises that incredibly important and maybe terrifying final question. Are we, as a species, remotely prepared psychologically, ethically, philosophically for a future where even our most fundamental desires are no longer taken as given, but become objects of deliberate design? What happens when the engineers of the future can engineer the very core of what it means to want something?
Wow, what an absolutely incredible, sprawling, mind-bending journey we've taken today, diving deep into the entire epic story of Homo sapiens from our very humble, almost insignificant beginnings on the savannah, right up to this present moment where we seem poised to become, quite literally maybe, architects of life, maybe even architects of desire itself.
Yeah, we've seen how these massive revolutions, cognitive, the agricultural, the scientific, the industrial, have just relentlessly reshaped not only our external world, but our societies, our bodies, our minds, our very essence.
It really forces you, the listener, to reflect on these immense transformations, doesn't it? And the huge, often really unsettling questions all this change raises about human nature, about society, about where we're headed collectively.
Absolutely. The lines we used to draw between human and animal, between natural and artificial, between objective reality and shared fiction, maybe even between life and non-life, they all seem to be blurring at this incredible accelerating pace. So, well, it's dizzying to think about.
It really is. And as we stand here, right on the threshold of potentially creating our own successors, maybe even engineering our own deepest wants, perhaps the most urgent deep dive we need to take isn't just into the next technological breakthrough, but into those unexamined desires, values, and assumptions driving us forward. What will we truly choose to become when we gain the power to choose not only what we do, but maybe even what we want to do? That's a question I think for all of us to seriously ponder as we step into whatever comes next.